Welcome to the Real News Network in Baltimore. I'm Kim Brown. More than $4 billion is needed by the end of March to help nearly 20 million people who risk starvation in Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said on Wednesday in the first declaration of famine since 2011. Let's take a look at the clip from the UN press conference.
The situation is dire. Millions of people are barely surviving in the space between malnutrition and death, vulnerable diseases and outbreaks, forced to kill their animals for food and eat the grain they saved for next year's seeds. This is preventable if the international community takes decisive action. I urge all members of the international community to step up and to do whatever is in their power, whether that is mobilizing support, exerting political pressure on parties to the conflict, or funding humanitarian operations. And I want to make a personal appeal to the parties to conflict to abide by international humanitarian law and allow aid workers access to rich people in desperate need. The lives of millions of people depend on our collective ability to act, and in our world of plenty, there is no excuse for inaction or indifference. We have heard the alerts. Now there is no time to lose.
Citing armed conflicts and climate change as part of the reasons for the food emergency, Guterres led a call for $5.6 billion in funding for humanitarian operations in the four countries this year, of which $4.4 billion is needed by the end of next month to, quote, and avert a catastrophe. And with us to discuss the hunger crisis in South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, and Northeast Nigeria is Nnimmo Bassey. Nnimmo is one of Africa's leading advocates and campaigners for the environment and for human rights. Nnimmo has stood up against the practices of multinational corporations in his country and the environmental devastation that they leave behind, destroying the lives and ignoring the rights of the local population. His recent article on fossil fuels, Social Change and Transformation, published by the International Social Science Council, is titled "System Change Will Not Be Negotiated." And we appreciate Nnimmo joining us today from Nigeria's capital. Nnimmo, thank you for being here back with us on The Real News.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Nnimmo, the UN representatives they cited both armed conflicts and climate change as part of the reasons for the food emergency. So is this the case for all of the regions where there is a food crisis, and are different influences at play, say in South Sudan versus Somalia versus Yemen versus Northeast Nigeria, for example?
Unfortunately, in most of the areas, we have these two key factors: climate change and then conflict, armed conflict. But of course, there are other places where you cannot blame this on armed conflict, like you have food shortages in parts of Kenya, northeastern Kenya, that is not exactly caused by conflict, although you can trace some elements of conflict there. But in places like Somalia, they've been in a constant state of conflict for a very long time. In southeastern Ethiopia, there's also food shortages. That is mostly climate change. In northeastern Nigeria, it's both climate change, combination of climate change and conflict, which is really very disastrous. So in sum, we could say that conflict compound the food shortages that would have come mostly from global warming. So it just makes the situation worse than it would have been.
So last week, the UN representatives, they said about these different reasons factoring in, and we hear about the civil strife in Nigeria from Boko Haram, or which South Sudan has been mired in civil war since 2013, with fighting splitting the country along ethnic lines. Of course, there has been a civil war in Yemen, and the African Union and Somali troops fighting in the extremist group Al-Shabaab in Somalia. So is this strife the result of food shortages driven by climate change, or are food shortages being exacerbated by these violent conflicts, or is it a bit of both?
There's some merchants of conflicts around the world, and there's some people benefiting from misery, benefiting from destruction and wars. War is a big industrial complex because those who manufacture the weapons are perpetually looking for ways to test the weapons. They're looking for new markets, and they're just enemies of peace. It's so shocking that in a world as advanced as we find ourselves in now, we're still engaged in the most primitive forms of warfare, even using high technology. And so the hunger and famine we're experiencing in many countries right now is a large part of it is being increased and compounded by conflict. Take a place like northeastern Nigeria. Northeastern Nigeria used to be one of the most fertile bread baskets of Nigeria, with most of the population engaged in farming and feeding the rest of the country with their products. They have very nice weather, very nice healthy soil, fertile soil. But with Boko Haram, farmers have been displaced from their farms, and those who have stayed back have been killed, and whole villages and towns destroyed by this kind of violence. So you find that people have not been able to return to their lands to farm, and farming is extremely dangerous when you're exposed like that without any defense. And so that has locked in hunger in northeastern Nigeria. And efforts are being made right now to get the farmers back to their communities and back to the land. So that is the only way to solve that problem is to build peace in that area. The same thing in Southern Sudan. Southern Sudan is not a place that should be in famine right now, but years of conflict, years of displacement have forced farmers off their lands. And even those who farm today, they don't easily find means of sending the food crops to areas where they are needed because of insecurity in some of the territories. So violence is one of the biggest challenges we are facing in these nations that are confronted with famine at this moment.
Nnimmo, in your recent article titled "System Change Will Not Be Negotiated," you write, quote, "Poor, vulnerable, and cash-strapped nations that contribute little or nothing to global warming see the trickles that drop in their empty bowls from market mechanisms, while their citizens are displaced from their homes, rather from their territories, forced to bear a disproportionate level of real climate actions," end quote. So is the level of African migration rising due to climate change, and is this famine an example of things to come, in your opinion?
The famine we're seeing now is a very stark picture of what we may see in the future. And it is our hope and expectation that this would not come to pass, but this is being extremely optimistic because indicators show that things are going to get worse before they will ever get better. And it's mostly, as I said in that article, the poor people, vulnerable people are the ones who are forced to take climate action by having their forests designated as carbon stocks or carbon sinks, and they're displaced from using the resources that they have. So the little they have, they are being excluded from using it because somebody thinks that carbon in any part of the world is equal to carbon in another part of the world. So somebody in the United States can keep polluting, pumping carbon from either fracking or extraction of tar sands in Canada, or some dirty industry polluting the atmosphere, and then you keep communities away from a forest in Africa, and the carbon in the trees are equated to the carbon that is being released into the atmosphere from polluting industries in North America. This is great injustice. It keeps people in poverty, keeps people away from their food sources, and of course, migration would have to happen, because when you, as one of you said recently, this is a common saying, when you push a man to the wall and he has nowhere else to retreat, he has to push back. And one of the ways to push back is to find where they can find some food and where they can find a semblance of peace away from the violence that they've been forced to experience, both from climate change and from open violence. So no matter the kind of walls anybody builds on the borders of any country, desperate environmental refugees will climb over those walls.
Indeed. We have been joined today with Nnimmo Bassey. He is one of Africa's leading advocates and campaigners for the environment and human rights. We've been discussing the United Nations call for more than $4 billion to go to 4 countries that are in desperate need of food aid: South Sudan, Somalia, Yemen, and Northeast Nigeria. The United Nations Secretary General says that over $4 billion is needed by the end of March to, quote, avert a catastrophe. Nnimmo, we appreciate you joining us and speaking to us about this very serious subject. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. People always worry about $4 billion of money to go a lot more than that is being spent on warfare on a daily basis. So it shouldn't be a problem finding $4 billion even tomorrow.
Indeed. And thank you for watching the Real News Network.